My earliest memory of betrayal took place when I was 16, and my entire world came crashing down. I remember how the sun dipped below the horizon on the day my parents told me to leave. They stood in our cramped living room with boxes at their feet, old furniture pressed against the wall, and glared at me with unflinching eyes. My mother's lips tightened as she thrust a threadbare backpack into my arms. My father just stared at the floor, refusing to speak. Beside them was my twin sister, Harper, with her arms crossed, a slight sneer on her face. She always had that look when she knew she was about to get her way. When they opened the door, I stepped onto the porch, my legs trembling. The wind bit at my cheeks as if to mock my terror. I glanced back just once, hoping someone would call me inside or offer an explanation, but there was only silence and the hollow sound of my mother snapping the door shut. That night, the foundation of everything I believed in shattered, and I found myself thrown into a world I was ill-prepared to face alone. I stumbled down the street, the weight of my backpack pulling at my shoulders. For a while, I wandered aimlessly, passing dimly lit houses and cracked sidewalks as my mind struggled to process what had just happened. Eventually, I ended up in a small park I'd once visited on a field trip. The night air was damp, and the grass felt like cold needles against my ankles. I sat under an oak tree, leaning against its trunk, and tried to think of a plan. The truth was, I had nowhere to go. No relatives nearby, no friends willing to take me in without causing an uproar in their own homes. My parents were always good at making sure I had no safety net beyond their control. I think that was their twisted way of holding power over me, even though I never understood why they despised me more than Harper. Maybe it was the fact that I asked questions, that I refused to simply accept their rules without reason. My sister rarely questioned anything. She was the golden child who did exactly what they wanted. That night, as I listened to my stomach growl, I realized I needed to rely on myself more than ever before. I spent that first night on the cold ground, jolted awake by every rustling leaf and snapping twig. By morning, my back was stiff and my cheeks were raw from the chilly air. A kind old man who walked his dog in the park noticed me as the sun rose. He offered me a spare sandwich and a cup of coffee from a thermos, asking gently if I was all right. Embarrassed and proud, I lied and said I was just traveling. But he must have sensed something was off because he left me with a few dollars and a note that read, "If you need help, come see me at the diner on 4th. I kept that note for years, though I never used it. The sense of shame I felt for being thrown away by my own family, my own twin, was overwhelming. Instead of seeking help, I decided I'd forge my path, no matter how difficult. Over the next few days, I scavenged for food, rummaging through dumpsters behind restaurants after closing time. The hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. I told myself that I had to be strong, that one day I would look back on this and realize it had shaped me into someone unbreakable. Eventually, I realized I needed shelter, especially as autumn winds grew sharper. With no money for a motel, I saved up what I could from doing odd jobs, scrubbing dishes in a small cafe, sweeping floors after closing time at a convenience store. Anything to earn a few dollars. Still, it wasn't enough for rent. One day, I stumbled upon a heavily discounted tent in a sporting goods store. Using the last of my meager savings, I bought it. That tent became my home, pitched at the edge of a quiet wooded area on the outskirts of town. I remember the first night I crawled inside. It was cramped and smelled of plastic, but it was mine. I'd zip it up, lay on a thin foam pad, and pretend I was somewhere safe. The rustle of branches overhead became a lullaby, reminding me that, while my family had abandoned me, nature offered a simple, unjudging existence. Each morning, I'd wake up with dew clinging to the tent walls. I'd gather my few belongings and leave for whichever odd job I could find that day. Sometimes I worried about wildlife or strangers stumbling upon my makeshift home, but fear became second nature. I told myself I had nothing left to lose. It was during my time in that tent that I learned to become resourceful. I'd bathe in a nearby creek, brushing my teeth with a bottle of water I'd fill up in public restrooms. On days off, I'd use the library's computers to hunt for better-paying jobs and read survival tips. Pride was my Achilles heel. I refused to contact any outreach programs or homeless shelters, too ashamed to let anyone see just how low I'd fallen. But life has a way of teaching you humility when you need it most. One bitterly cold night, a storm raged through town. The wind ripped one of my tent stakes free, and rain poured in until I was soaked to the bone. My clothes and sleeping bag were drenched. Shivering, I huddled in a corner, praying the storm would pass. By morning, I was exhausted, half frozen, and depressed enough to question whether I should continue at all. Yet, something in me refused to succumb to despair. Maybe it was anger at my parents for throwing me away, anger at Harper for her smug sense of entitlement. That fury sparked a determination in me. I would make it. If only to prove them wrong, I would survive and become something they never expected. I think the turning point arrived when I found a steadier job at a small construction site. The foreman, a gruff man named Stan, saw me do some heavy lifting for a few bucks and asked if I'd come back the next day. Stan taught me basics: mixing cement, hauling lumber, hammering nails. I'd go to the site at dawn, work until late afternoon, then head back to my tent. On weekends, I'd pick up extra shifts. My body grew sore and calloused, but my wallet slowly grew heavier. The sense of independence that money brought was exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I saw a future that wasn't defined by my family's neglect. I imagined renting a room in a boarding house, maybe taking some night classes. Each payday, I tucked away a few bills under a loose plank in a derelict shed near my campsite. That money became my lifeline, a tangible reminder that I was carving out a life on my own terms. A few of the guys on the site teased me at first, calling me kid, but gradually they accepted me as part of the team. With every sweaty shift, I felt my self-respect blossom, and the bitterness toward my old life grew. Months turned into a year, and I finally saved enough to leave the tent behind. I rented a tiny studio apartment that smelled of mildew, but it felt like a mansion to me. My first night there, I laid on the creaky mattress and stared at the cracked ceiling, tears slipping from the corners of my eyes. It was gratitude, pure and fierce, tinged with a simmering anger at the family who never once checked if I was still alive. Harper had always been my mirror image, but she never tried to find me. My parents, with all their self-righteous rules, never made a single phone call. The resentment fueled my ambition. I committed myself to working harder, saving more, and someday surpassing every expectation they had for me. I soon took a second job at a warehouse, unloading trucks overnight. My days and nights blurred into one long shift, but I didn't care. The more I worked, the closer I felt to a version of success that no one could take away. I enrolled in evening classes at the local community college. Some days I'd rush from the construction site to the classroom, my clothes caked in dust and cement. No one asked questions, no one pitied me. Over time, I started to build a life I was proud of. My grades were decent, my savings grew, and I managed to upgrade to a better apartment. The sting of betrayal never left me, though. It lived under my skin like a deep splinter, a constant reminder that my own flesh and blood deemed me disposable. I didn't speak of it often, but it colored every decision I made. Whenever a challenge arose, I'd remember that night they turned their backs, and it fueled my determination. Eventually, I finished my associate's degree in business administration while juggling work. With that credential, I landed a job in the administrative office of a local construction firm. It was a step up from manual labor, still demanding but more stable hours. I made connections, learned about property values, investments, and mortgages. The idea of owning my own home one day began to take shape. I worked to improve my credit score, took on side gigs, and saved every spare dime. And all the while, I kept waiting for a sign that my parents or Harper had even a shred of remorse. But there was nothing. No letters, no calls. I was alone, yet strangely content with the life I was forging. 5 years after the night I was cast out, I stood on the porch of a modest 2-bedroom house I had just purchased. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. The mortgage was manageable, and the yard had space for a small garden. I remember holding the keys in my hand, my heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and residual anger. My parents hadn't simply thrown me out of their home, they'd hurled me into a pit of desperation, and I had clawed my way out alone. That moment was bittersweet. As I walked through the empty rooms, I envisioned a life where I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. I could paint the walls any color I wanted, invite whomever I pleased, and lock the door whenever I chose. Everything about that house felt like an affirmation of my worth, a rebuttal to the years of feeling worthless. I remember kneeling in the front yard and pressing my palm to the earth, whispering a quiet vow. I'd never let anyone take this from me. I'd fought too hard, endured too much, to ever be rendered powerless again. Little did I know that Val would be tested sooner than I could imagine. Not long after I settled into my new home, there came a knock on my door one crisp morning. I wasn't expecting visitors, so my guard was immediately up. When I opened it, there stood my sister, Harper, along with our parents, all wearing expressions that veered between guilt and desperation. Harper held a toddler in her arms, and a lanky man with anxious eyes hovered behind her. I froze, my hand gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. 1,000 questions roared through my mind, but I could only stare, stunned by their audacity. They acted like it was the most natural thing in the world to show up unannounced. My mother tried to step forward, arms outstretched as if expecting a warm hug. My father looked older, more worn, but he didn't meet my eyes. Harper, for her part, didn't say a word, just gave me this slight nod, as if I should be grateful they had finally come around. I felt my stomach tighten, a swirl of rage and disbelief. Their faces brought back every memory of sleeping in a damp tent, of not knowing where my next meal would come from, of feeling alone and unlovable. I wanted to slam the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped onto the porch, shutting the door behind me. I didn't invite them in. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother's voice cracked as she explained they'd come on hard times. There was mention of job losses, a foreclosure, and Harper's husband leaving them in debt. My father cleared his throat and said something about family sticking together. The hypocrisy was nauseating. Harper just looked away, rocking her child in her arms. And then came the bombshell. They were hoping to move in with me, at least until they could get back on their feet. They offered no apologies, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused. It was as if the past never happened. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body screaming for me to tell them to get off my property. But the child in Harper's arms made me pause. Innocent in all this, the toddler had no idea what storm it was caught in. My parents looked at me with an expectation that bordered on entitlement. Their eyes scanned my house and yard, likely imagining how they'd rearrange furniture and settle into a life they didn't earn. My mind whirled with memories of hunger and cold, of forging my own path with zero help from them. In that charged moment, I recalled my sleepless nights in the tent, the humiliations of scrounging for food, and the raw determination that had fueled my every step toward independence. Their sudden appearance felt like a slap in the face. Yet, I also recognized that turning them away without a word would only validate their warped narrative that I was the ungrateful one. So I took a breath and told them plainly, I can't have you all move in here. My mother's eyes widened. My father opened his mouth in protest, but I cut him off. You threw me out when I was 16. Remember that? I slept in a park. I lived in a tent. I nearly froze to death while you all pretended I didn't exist. My voice shook with restrained fury. Harper tried to interject, saying she was just a kid back then, but I reminded her that she was my twin and she never lifted a finger to help. The tension spiraled and my mother let out a choked sob, calling me heartless. You made me this way, I retorted. I told them they had 1 hour to leave my property. If they refused, I'd call the police. I wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. They left in a flurry of anger and tears. Harper's child started crying, and she rushed to the car, muttering insults under her breath. My mother sobbed dramatically, calling me cruel and ungrateful, while my father glowered at me with an expression I couldn't quite decode: anger, shame, and maybe a hint of regret. But no apologies, no acceptance of responsibility. When their car finally pulled away, I stood in my driveway, trembling. The adrenaline rushed through me, leaving me shaky and breathless. Part of me felt victorious, but another part felt exhausted by the sheer weight of reliving that trauma. Over the next few days, I half expected them to return, maybe with pleas or threats. Instead, I received a barrage of accusatory messages through social media from extended relatives, many of whom had never bothered to check on me before. They parroted my parents' sob story, insisting I was obligated to help. Each message was a dagger, reopening old wounds, but I refused to bend. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that 16-year-old version of myself standing on my parents' porch with nowhere to go, and I remembered how none of those relatives had reached out then. Sweet revenge indeed was denying them the comfort they'd denied me. In the weeks that followed, I began to feel a weight lifting from my shoulders. I continued with my life, my job, my home improvements, my small circle of supportive friends. I planted flowers in my garden, repainted the living room, and even got a dog from the local shelter. The dog, a scrappy mutt named Rosie, became the family I had longed for. She was fiercely loyal, and I realized that loyalty was something my blood relatives had never offered. I found myself breathing easier, laughing more freely, and sleeping without nightmares for the first time in years. I'd lie on the couch in the evenings with Rosie curled at my feet, marveling at how peace could feel so foreign, yet so natural. Occasionally, I'd glance at a framed photo of myself in college or the faint scars on my hands from construction work, and I'd remember how far I'd come. My parents and Harper remained ghosts of a past life, a life I had survived and transcended. If they thought they could waltz back in and claim my success, they were mistaken. The sense of closure was palpable, like I'd finally sealed a door on a chapter that no longer had power over me. Still, I do not regret turning them away. Their betrayal taught me resilience and self-worth. Forgiveness might be a virtue, but I chose justice over absolution. My family reaped what they sowed. Each breath I take in my own house, each warm night under a sturdy roof, is a triumph over the darkness they forced on me. They may call me cold-hearted, but they forget the frost that once gripped my bones. Absolutely no remorse, no second chance. I survived alone. Now I thrive alone, owing them nothing.